Once upon a time, in the Ngugu kingdom, lived a man called Remy. Remy was married to Abomma. They had a daughter named Adaku. Adaku was the center of her parents' world. They loved her and provided all she needed. The family was happy. However, when Adaku was 15, Abomma died. This left the family devastated. Remy promised his dying wife that he would take care of Adaku. 5 years after her death, Remy married another woman named Fonke. Fonke had a daughter named Chisom. She was the same age as Adako. Remy was happy as this would give Adako the opportunity to have a sibling around her age. Adako thought so as well. However, she came to find out that her life was about to become a living hell. Fonke and her daughter Chisom tormented Adako to no end. They turned her into a slave in her own father's house. She was not allowed to sleep on her bed, but on the kitchen floor. She was not allowed to eat when others ate. She was only given scraps as meal. One day she cried and asked her stepmother, "Why do you hate me so much?" But Funke only laughed, saying, "It is only my daughter Chisom that will have the prince and not you." You see, at this time was a period when the next queen was to come from Remy's family line. Everyone knew of his two daughters, Adaku and Chisom. Chisom was the most beautiful of the two. Men always asked for her hand in marriage. The prince's friends would tell him to marry Chisom as she was the most beautiful. But what they did not know was that for a while, even before Remy married Fonke, the prince had been observing Adaku, and she was the one he wanted to marry. However, his father and king wanted him to marry Chisom, but to do that, the prince had to marry Adaku and then Chisom, because in their culture, the first daughter had to be married first. The prince didn't mind as Adaku was his intended all along. However, he didn't want to marry Chisom. He had heard reports that she was a very rude and wicked girl, as her beauty was getting into her head. To prove this to his father, he hatched a plan with the king's most trusted manservant. The prince stood back in the bushes as the manservant, dressed up as a beggar, went up to Remy's house. It was Chisom that saw him first. The man asked, "Please give me some water, I'm very thirsty." The man was pretending to be dying of thirst. Chisom pushed him away, saying, "Get away from here. Get away from this place. How did you get here?" The man fell down. When Funke came out to see what was happening, she saw the man and also rebuked him, saying that this is not a place for beggars. Go away from here. Go and look for water somewhere else. The servant left. He was getting close to the prince and was almost out of character when someone called out to him. Immediately, he switched back to being a beggar. He turned and it was Adako. She ran up to him with a big calabash of water. She said, "I'm so sorry about my stepmother and stepsister. Here, have some water." He took the water and drank some, and then he thanked her. She asked him, "Do you want some food?" But the man said no, and then she left. What she did not know was that the prince was 2 steps at her back. He was looking at her from the bushes. That night, the manservant confirmed to the king that Chisom was not the best choice as a future queen. The prince should go ahead with Adako, as she would make a good queen who would have the people's interest at heart. And so the king agreed. It was announced that the prince would marry Adako. Adako was so happy to hear this. She went to her father's room to tell him. Since his second marriage, Remy had been bedridden. He was a vegetable. No herbalist knew what the problem was. He couldn't stand up from bed. Adako would spend as much time as she could with her father, keeping him company. Funke and Chisom never spent time with him. On the day of the traditional wedding, the bride was covered with a cloth, as was tradition. No one could see her face, not even the prince. That was the culture and part of the traditional rites of the wedding. The prince took his bride home. As they were about to consummate the marriage, the prince lifted the cloth covering his bride. He was so happy that finally Adako was his wife. But to his surprise, he saw Chisom. At first, a flash of light went through his eyes, and then both Adaku's face and Chisom's face were flashing through his eyes, but holding his staff of authority, he called on his ancestors and his vision became clear. Standing before him was indeed Chisom. What was happening? He said. How could she be here? The prince shouted, What are you doing here? And where is Adaku? Chisom said, I am Adaku, your wife, in a very quiet and sly voice. The prince was confused. Are you mad? He asked. You're not Adaku. You're Chisom. Where is Adaku? He asked. Once he called her name, Chisom's face started turning into a black burnt pot. The prince was more confused. What is going on here? He shouted. Then he called his servant. At this time, Chisom had started screaming. She was shouting, Mama, Mama, Mama. The servants just looked at her in confusion as her whole body and face turned into a burnt plantain. The king burst into the prince's chambers with the chief priest. It was the chief priest that said someone should go and call her mother. What was happening to her was not ordinary. So Fonke was brought into the palace, and she screamed and shouted, What have you done to my daughter? You will pay. The prince was confused. I did not touch her. She is not my bride. For God's sake, where is Adaku? It was the chief priest who shouted at the woman, You evil woman, he said. What have you done? Confess, otherwise your daughter will die in your arms. And so, Fonke confessed. They knew the prince wanted to marry Adaku. So with the help of a juju man, they turned Adaku to a goat. Ah! Everybody shouted. A goat? The juju man gave Chisom a white substance to rub on her face. Once the prince lifted up the cloth covering her face, then he would see Adaku and fall in love with her. The plan had worked, but she did not know what had happened. The chief priest laughed and said, No black magic can work against the royal family, as their staff of authority is fortified with powers of the previous kings. And that is why the magic did not work on the prince. Everyone was amazed. Ah, where is Adaku? The prince asked. Where is she and what have you done to her? Fonke confessed that they locked her up in her father's room. The prince stepped over Chisom's body and ran with his guards to Remi's house. They went in and saw Remi lying down on the bed and a goat tied to a pole next to the bed. Using his ancestral powers, the prince turned Adaku back into a human being and woke her father up. Adaku was so happy and started crying as she saw her father get up. Surprisingly, her father was also crying. He said that one day Fonke had served him a meal, and since then he had become trapped in his body. He could see all that Adaku went through, but he couldn't break free to help her. Chisom died, and Fonke was beheaded. Thank you so much for listening to another episode. If you liked it, please subscribe, like, comment, share. Thank you to those who have subscribed. Thank you to those who have supported. Until next time, goodbye.